All right, let's talk about a name you've probably heard if you've ever cracked open a Psych 101 textbook, Phineas Gage. Yeah, you know the story, the gruesome accident, the man who was never the same, the giant leap in brain science. But here's the thing. What if almost everything you think you know about that story is wrong? So here he is. This is probably the most famous patient in all of neuroscience for, 170 plus years. His story has been the go-to example, a real cautionary tale, right, about how a brain injury can just completely obliterate a personality, turning a good man into, well, a monster. But new evidence is painting a totally different picture, one that's less about destruction and a whole lot more about incredible, almost unbelievable resilience. So, okay, before we can tear down the myth, we gotta build it up first. We need to go over the story that everyone thinks they know. And it all kicks off with an accident that is, seriously, it's one of the most horrific things you'll ever hear about in medical history. All right, picture this. It's a September afternoon, 1848. Phineas Gage, a railroad foreman in Vermont, he's getting ready to blast some rock. Maybe he gets distracted for just a split second, and that's when it happens. The gunpowder goes off, and his tamping iron, we're talking a 13-pound, 3.5-foot-long metal rod, basically a giant spear, it shoots out of the hole like a missile. It goes right under his left cheek, through his brain, and out the top of his skull, landing like 80 feet away. And the craziest part? He never lost consciousness. He was talking within minutes, sat up for the whole cart ride back to town, and when he saw the doctor, he apparently just said, "Here's business enough for you." Unbelievable. His doctor, a guy named John Harlow, somehow miraculously saves his life. But in his report, the report that would define Gage for a century, Harlow talks about this profound change. He says the injury destroyed the, and I'm quoting here, the balance between his intellectual faculties and his animal propensities. Wow, that one phrase, that's basically the seed from which the entire myth grew. So according to Harlow, the guy who was once this polite, reliable foreman was now just all over the place. He was supposedly disrespectful, swore like a sailor, couldn't follow through on anything. He lost his job, of course. He even ended up working for P.T. Barnum for a bit, as a museum exhibit. The story that got passed down was simple. The iron bar didn't just punch a hole in his head, it punched a hole in his soul. And his friends, well, they supposedly put it in the most chilling way possible. They just said, Gage was no longer Gage. And that was it. That's the line that really sealed the deal, cementing this idea that he was a totally different person, just a shell of the man he used to be. But this is where the story takes a turn, because for decades, that was pretty much all we knew. And it's a great story, right? But what if it's not the whole story? What if it's incomplete, or worse, just plain exaggerated because of what scientists wanted to believe back then? So let's start pulling at the threads of this myth. See, the big problem is that Dr. Harlow's original report was super short, like just a few hundred words. It left all of these massive gaps in Gage's story. And you know what happens with gaps? People filled them. Scientists, writers, they all just started speculating. Suddenly, you hear rumors that he was a violent drunk, or a brawler, or a total con man. I mean, even today, you can find textbooks that can't get the story straight. One calls him promiscuous, another says he was emotionally flat. These stories just got told over and over until everyone assumed they were true. So it all comes down to this really important question. How much of this wild story is based on actual, evidence? And how much of it is just what people assumed would happen to a guy who got a metal rod shot through his brain? Well, it turns out historians have been digging, and they've found a totally different story. A story that isn't about a man falling apart, but about an incredible, astonishing recovery. And it all hinges on a huge chunk of his life that most textbooks just conveniently ignore. 7 years. That's the key. So what was he doing for those 7 years? I'll tell you what he wasn't doing. He wasn't just drifting around in a circus. Get this. He moved to Chile. And for 7 years, he worked a steady, incredibly demanding job as a stagecoach driver. We're talking hauling people and luggage over these rough, dangerous mountain roads between Valparaiso and Santiago. This is absolutely not a job for some unreliable, impulsive drifter. I mean, just think for a second about what that job takes. You have to drive a 6-horse coach that requires planning, focus, serious skill. He had to wrangle the horses, navigate dangerous trails, deal with all kinds of passengers, handle their fares and luggage. These are complex social skills,
complex cognitive skills, the exact skills the legend says he completely lost. So let's just lay it all out. Myth versus reality. The myth says he was an unemployable bum. The evidence? He held a really hard job for 7 years. The myth says he was an antisocial drifter. The reality? His job required him to be social and plan ahead every single day. He supposedly had no sense about money, but he was literally collecting fares. And while the legend says he was ruined, get this, a doctor who actually examined him in Chile said he had, and this is a direct quote, no impairment whatever. That's a pretty big difference.
And then there's this photograph. It was only discovered back in 2008, and it just completely blows the old story out of the water. Just look at him. He's proud, he's well-dressed, he looks confident, holding the very iron that almost killed him. That is not the face of a man whose life is in shambles. That is the face of a survivor. Okay, so the big question is why? Why did the monster story stick around for so long? And more importantly, what does the real story of Phineas Gage have to teach us today? The truth is, Gage's story became a sort of Rorschach test for science. One of those ink blots where everyone sees something different? With so few actual facts to go on, different generations of scientists just projected their own pet theories onto him. His story was used to prove everything from phrenology, the whole head bumps thing, to modern theories about the frontal lobe. The myth was it was too good of a story for anyone to bother fact-checking it. And you can really see how our understanding has changed. Back in the 19th century, you had phrenologists saying the iron must have destroyed his organ of veneration, and that's why he started swearing. Seriously. Fast forward to today, and we can take CT scans of his actual skull and create these incredible 3D models that show us exactly which neural pathways, which wires in his brain were severed. And what these new models show us is fascinating. Yeah, the injury took out about 4% of his gray matter, the actual brain cells, but it did way more damage to the white matter, wiping out about 11% of it. And that's the brain's wiring, the connections between different areas. That damage almost certainly explains those early personality changes. But here's the flip side. It also shows us how much of his brain was left untouched, which helps explain how he was able to recover. So, see, the real story of Phineas Gage isn't just about what was destroyed. It's one of our best and earliest examples of neuroplasticity, this amazing ability the brain has to heal and rewire itself. That superstructured job he had in Chile, it probably acted like a kind of rehab program, forcing his brain to build new pathways, to find new ways to work. He learned how to live again. In the end, even with all the myths and fabrications, Gage's story still gave us something huge. It was one of the first real-world proofs of a revolutionary idea, that who we are, our personality, our self, it isn't some mystical thing. It's physically located in the tissue of our brain. The injury absolutely changed him, there's no doubt about that. But what his life after the accident shows us is that change doesn't have to be the end of the story. So we're left with a totally different takeaway. The old legend, the myth of Phineas Gage, was a story about how fragile we are. But the true story? It's about how incredibly resilient we can be. I mean, if a man who went through one of the most horrific brain injuries we can even imagine could find a way back, could rebuild a life for himself, what does that say about the true limits of human resilience and the amazing power of our brains to heal?